Good morning. My name is Trish Secca, and I'm the Senior Nutrition Program Manager here at IFINS, the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Science. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Emerging Science, Leveraging Innovation to Address Technical Challenges of Reducing Sodium in Foods. This webinar is the fifth in a series of 7 free webinars and an invitation-only expert convening at the culmination of the series. The project is part of a broad IFINS effort to promote understanding of what's new about the many roles of sodium in the diet, health, consumer preferences, food safety, and quality. This work was supported by the IFINS Sodium in Foods and Health Implications Committee, and you can learn more by visiting our website at ifins.org. For those that are new to IFINS, IFINS mobilizes government, industry, and academia to drive, fund, and lead actionable science in the areas of food safety and nutrition. We catalyze the creation of scientific knowledge by funding external researchers and convening experts to support positive change. And our collaborative and inclusive structure empowers members to bring forward the diverse perspectives of the entire food and beverage ecosystem. Some of you might see this panel on your GoToWebinar screen. The orange arrow allows you to expand and collapse the control panel, and the area for questions is where you can ask questions during the presentation. Only staff can see questions, and we will address them during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Some of you may have an older version of GoToWebinar, but it works the same way. You can expand and collapse the control panel, and you can enter your questions during the presentation. IFINS is also a continuing education provider with the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and this webinar will award 1.5 CPEUs from the Commission on Dietetic Registration, and a link will be sent to attendees following the webinar to access your CPEU certificate. So now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Janice Johnson. Janice is the Technical Service Advisor within the Salt Division of Cargill, a leading provider of agricultural products and services to the food industry, and is the past chair of IFINS Sodium Committee. In her role at Cargill, Janice conducts scientific research on salt and sodium and shares market research insights with their customers. Janice received her PhD in food science from the University of Wisconsin. Madison, please welcome Janice.
Great, thank you, Trish, and welcome everyone. As Trish mentioned, this is the Emerging Science within the IFINS Sodium Reduction webinar series. So glad that you're able to attend today. This is the last one for the week, but not to worry, you get the opportunity to watch 2 more series next week. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, or our first speaker, I should say, and that is Dr. Soo-Yen Lee. Dr. Soo-Yen Lee graduated from Yonsei University in Seoul, Korea in 1994 with a bachelor's in food engineering. In 2001, she earned her PhD in food science from the University of California, Davis. She then moved to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign to assume a faculty position, where she was promoted to full professor in 2015. Dr. Lee has taught sensory science as well as other courses in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition, with her main research focusing on sensory science. She received various recognitions related to teaching, such as the USDA Regional Award in Excellence in Teaching and the William V. Cruez Award for Excellence in Teaching from the Institute of Food Technologists. Dr. Lee has received over 100 peer-reviewed publications and had received research honors from IFT, the Samuel V. Prescott Award in 2011. In her current role, Dr. Lee serves as the professor and director of the School of Food Science at the Washington State University. Sue, I'll turn the presentation over to you, and I enjoy looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much for such a nice introduction. I don't know where everyone is, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all. I'm very happy to share my findings of this qualitative study that we have already published, yet not presented anywhere, so this is a new presentation. So yes, This work was supported by the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, as you all know, IFANS, and the Sodium Committee of IFANS specifically funded this work. Thank you. Average sodium intake in the US for adults is around 3,400 milligram, which is way above the adequate intake that is recommended by the FDA, which is 1,500 milligram per day. It is also significantly above the upper limit, the maximum amount that is recommended daily, which is 2,300 milligram. Unfortunately, greater than 97% of Americans ages 1 and up consume sodium in quantities above the adequate intake set for their age and gender group. In the US, 77% of sodium intake comes from processed and prepared foods, and American Heart Association in 2020 published the Salty 6, recognizing the 6 major group of food that we as Americans consume the most salt of, which includes bread and rolls, cured meats, pizza, sandwiches, soups, and poultry. In recognition of the health risks associated with sodium overconsumption, Institute of Medicine and FDA have published reports and guidelines for sodium reduction. So IOM published its report in 2010, and since then, which is about 15 years later now, there's been several publications by the FDA, and notably the 2016 reduction goals, which was voluntary. Initially, they were saying it could be mandatory for the food industry to abide by these recommendations, but it became a voluntary reduction goal, and they presented 2-year and 10-year reduction goals. In 2021, also recognizing that the 2-year short-term goal has passed, yet the sodium level in processed food remains to be the same. They published a revised short-term voluntary sodium reduction goals with the goal of 2.5 years to achieve the goal, which if you do the math, we're at that year, or past that year, in fact. The amount of reduction that they posed in 2016 for example, the 10-year goal, which we are approaching that since we're in 2024, was close to 50% for most of the processed and packaged food category. So it was an aggressive recommendation to reduce the sodium in the processed and packaged foods. With the funding supported by IFANS, our lab group published a scoping review in 2021 in the Comprehensive Reviews in Food Science and Food Safety. It encompassed more than 200 primary studies, in fact, 277 primary studies, and literature reviews and patents. And I'm going to present briefly on the findings of that scoping review so that we can move into our major part of the presentation on the qualitative study side. So in the scoping review, what we found, and just looking at the primary studies, so research articles, in the literature, it's reported that sodium replacers, namely potassium chloride as the replacer, is the most widely published. So 42% of what we investigated discussed and showed findings on sodium replacers to be the strategy used for sodium reduction. And then followed by salt removal. And this is, we just put it salt removal because in fact, 41% of the papers just showed that they removed salt and they just showed how the palatability changed. So it's without doing any mitigation strategy, just removing salt. And then 31% of the published literature reported on flavor modifications, such as using flavor enhancers, such as monosodium glutamate and mesquite. And then 23% of the publications reported on physical modification, which encompassed modifying the physical structure of the food, such as bread, for example, with different distributions of salt embedded in the bread, and seeing how that is effective in not having the palatability loss when you remove the salt. And then finally, 7% published on the functional modification. When we looked at the sodium reduction strategies investigated by year of publication, salt removal and salt replacer, as I mentioned in the previous slide, remains to be high. And then flavor modification, which is very interesting. If you look at the triangles in this graph, it's in fact exceeding the salt replacer. So in more recent years, flavor modification has been published a lot in the literature as the main strategy to be used. And then functional modification is slowly gaining its interest in research. Physical modification is still kind of lagging, and it's the interest is slowly increasing, but not as much. The rest of the presentation will focus on the findings from our qualitative study, where we investigated the practical applications of sodium reduction in food industry. Because you can't find these strategies that are used in food industry in literature, we had to conduct research on, and especially because a lot of the strategies that companies might use may be proprietary, we wanted to make sure that we capture that in our compendium of sodium reduction strategies. So the aim of the study was to characterize perceptions of sodium reduction in the food industry, including experiences with and awareness of various sodium reduction strategies through focus groups and one-on-one interviews. So we used two different modes of qualitative research based on certain criteria. The criteria that we use, namely, is shown in this flow chart. Recruitment-wise, we use in-person networking, LinkedIn messages, and also because the research was conducted when I was at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, we also reached out to our alumni contacts to see if we can find willing participants for our qualitative study. The flow chart, in fact, shows the process in which we placed panelists into either focus group or interview, or even not have them included. So the questions we asked is, where do you work in food industry? And so if they worked in any capacity in research and development or quality assurance or other departments, they were to be included. If they were only working in marketing and sales, then we would not include them in our focus group and interviews. And we asked the question of, are you comfortable responding in a group environment? If the answer was no, we put them in individual interview. If the answer was yes, then we followed up with the question, how many years have you worked in the food industry? If it was fewer than 10 years, then we placed them into focus group. And if it was more than 10 years, we placed them into individual interview, recognizing that with more experience in industry, they might have more to say and they might have more strategies to share, so that the time it takes to gather their information may take longer. So we wanted them to be interviewed individually. In total, we had 18 members participate, and 10 of them were placed in focus groups. So we conducted 3 mini focus groups with 3 people, 3 people, and 4 people, and 8 individual individual interviews. Okay. This is the focus group discussion guideline we followed using a professional moderator. Mainly what's of interest in this discussion guideline is the industry experience questions, where we ask what strategies your companies used and found successful versus found unsuccessful. What are the food categories that they used implemented for sodium reduction? And then opinion questions. So this is not an actual experience that they had, but what do you think would be a good product or product type that would benefit from sodium reduction? And then what are the needs? What are the gaps you're finding in implementation in industry in terms of sodium reduction? So these are our findings. Flavor modification by far was the major strategy that industry used as well. And really, again, the potassium chloride salt replacer was the main strategy that also is implemented in industry, either alone or blended. They also may use different tastes, such as umami or flavor enhancing capacity, to enhance that sodium replacer type of strategy. Salt removal and just removing salt and using functional modification method was discussed, but very rarely. So it was infrequent that those were discussed. Both the interviews and the focus group people aware of the FDA guidelines, and especially the newly released guidelines. At the time, it was quite hot off the press, and they were still aware of it. Interestingly, they were aware of it, but that did not have much impact on their daily work in R&D or quality assurance or sodium reduction type of work. Because what they mentioned was interesting, is that they're constantly monitoring these guidelines and they're aware of it, so it's not a surprise, and they've already been steadily working on it. So there wasn't a huge impact when the new guidelines were released. Opinions for what is needed in terms of sodium reduction, they actually mentioned in several different aspects, and we kind of bucket them into 3 different categories. So for example, consumer-focused efforts, and that's mainly in terms of nutrition education, how consumers can be informed of what they need in terms of health and wellness, especially in terms of the amount that should be consumed, and not just in numbers, but in actual meaningful quantities. And then personal responsibility to monitor the intake. That's on the consumers, is what the folks were saying, which makes sense. And then to aid in that, in terms of food industry, maybe we could make improvements in labeling and educating also for labeling understanding, because labels may be complicated to understand. In terms of the industry perspective, they wanted more regulatory pressure, which was very interesting. And they said, well, if we really want to make a wide sweeping change, then really we need the pressure by regulatory bodies. And then once those are implemented, then they need clear guidance of what it means to be at that level. And then maybe rethinking serving sizes, because serving sizes have increased and we're still using the serving size that are outdated. And then for future research in academia or industry, industry folks wanted what is behind the salty taste perception? Why are we finding it so favorable? And then improving technology and processing strategies. So there's still that need into coming up with newer and better strategy to mitigate the palatability loss. And then whatever strategies that we may implement needs to be affordable for industry to implement, and then cleaner label strategies, because consumers are really high on that. So to summarize the findings, 62% of what was reported by the industry folks was that we use flavor modification, mainly salt replacers and flavor enhancers. And then response to the FDA guidance document, people are aware, industry folks are aware, more than half, majority are aware of the guidance document. However, there's little to no impact because they were already preparing for it. And then opinions for future sodium research can be grouped into consumer-focused ways, industry-focused ways, and research-focused ways. So in conclusion, we see that flavor modification strategies such as salt replacers and flavor enhancers are widely published and they are widely used. So both the academic publications and industry usage align in this area. And really, if you want a change across the board, then regulatory pressure may be needed. And that was actually coming from food industry, which was interesting. Future work in sodium reduction needs to be aligned in several different areas, efforts directed towards consumers, and then industry efforts, but also with regulatory requirements imposed on industry. And then, of course, continued and new research focuses on better sodium reduction strategies that could be really, in terms of implementation, not too costly, and that is realistic. So yeah, and with that, I just wanted to have a little bit of a food science take on it, and really the food industry folks think that there could be more investigation research into flavor modification and not just salt replacers. Thank you, and with that, I open up for questions. Oh, Janice, I can't hear you.
My apologies. Sue, we'll take questions at the end after each speaker. So thank you so much, Sue. We really appreciate you sharing your research, because it's always good to get that baseline of the existing technologies that exist today and insights on this perspective, be it positive or negative, of those tools by food scientists, because that really is what emergent science is all about. It's about leveraging what we know today to help with those new discoveries of new solutions, be it new compounds or ingredients or processing technologies that will enable product developers and food manufacturers to achieve their sodium reduction goals in the future. Our next speaker, Dr. Andrew Danaher, will address this emergency science in the field of flavor. It's one of the biggest hurdles, as we know, for consumer acceptance. Andrew is a global leader of Explore Taste and Taste and Wellbeing at Givaudan. He leads the exploration of innovation technologies with special focus to create new natural taste and flavor ingredients, with an emphasis on enabling sugar and salt reduction. Andrew has over 30 years of experience with Givaudan, leading flavor science and technology. He received his BS in chemistry from John Carroll University and his PhD in organic chemistry from Washington University at St. Louis. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you so that you can lead us through your research.
Thanks, Janice. And yeah, it's Givaudan, and I've only been at Givaudan for 25 years, so not quite 30. So it was great to hear Sue's call out for more flavor modification, because that's what Givaudan does. We're a flavor company. So I am indeed at Givaudan. I work for Taste and Wellbeing in our Science and Technology group, and I lead what's called Explore Taste. And we are responsible for basically developing technologies internally for Givaudan that are used by our flavorists for our customers. So let me go to my next slide. Oh, you can see now things here, right? So I'm trying to close off some. Okay, all right. So here we go. So of course, we were all here because we're looking for healthier products. And one thing that Givaudan does is we try to enable healthier products, and specifically this topic is around enabling sodium chloride reduced products. And so you see there's this driver of change. And a lot of it comes, of course, because we're going for healthier products. And because of that too, we'll see restrictions on labels and requirements for our customers to make products that are able to be consumed by consumers that have less sodium chloride. And so you see then the needs really are technologies that will be able to do this. As part of that, it's not only the taste of sodium chloride, but it's also the, helping with the functionality in certain products. And what we hope to do is be able to enable the same great food experiences for full salt products. And part of this, and with the needs, is also better understanding of the mechanism. So our goal really is trying to be able to reduce sodium beyond 50% without compromising on taste. And in order to do this, we need to add to our toolbox. So Givaudan has been working in this space for a long time. For over 25 years, we have what's called an ingredient toolbox that our flavors use. And the toolbox consists of many things, of course, flavor modifiers, but there's also a strategy to try to limit the bitterness of potassium chloride, which is used for some of this in the strategy there. So if you kind of take a peek into the toolbox, you can see there's many different things here that the flavors can use when they're making solutions for our customers. I will focus on how we discover novel taste molecules, and these are indeed like the flavor modifiers that were mentioned earlier. But there's several other tools in the toolbox. It was mentioned you could add umami taste, which consumers sometimes confuse with the perception of sodium chloride. There's many other things that can be used that help when the flavors are building their solutions. But before I get into discovery, I wanted to talk a bit about an approach that we used using artificial intelligence. And we've been working on this, I think, for the last 5 years or so. So we have a program called ATOM, stands for Advanced Tools for Modeling. And what it allows the flavorists to do is to look through different combinations of tools in the toolbox and assemble them in such a way that we can get a desired result in the most efficient time possible. And so it's kind of like a nonlinear way of looking at maximum and combinations or benefit from putting all these different ingredients together. And so we did a study in our Latin America region in which the goal was to reduce sodium chloride by 33%, but get the full taste. And so our approach was basically we looked at our toolbox and we took about 17 ingredients that were in there that we currently have. And these had various different attributes. Some contributed to the body of salt, some was the time intensity, some went after lingering, and some added to the mouthfeel. And the strategy here was not to use potassium chloride. So we put these into the program. It's sort of a design of experiment with some artificial intelligence built into it. And what it does is it combines the ingredients at different levels and different combinations and makes samples for the panelists to taste. And we came up with only 50 samples, which represented combinations for these 17 different ingredients. And then they were evaluated and compared to the full salt reference. And from this, we were able to get sort of drivers of different attributes. And Adams gave us 3 recipes that had optimal results. And then when we went back and did a validation with sensory panels, we were versus the blind samples versus the control, we were able to see that we were able to achieve 33% reduction without using potassium chloride in these snacks. And so it's really a nice tool that we have that allows the flavors to explore sort of the toolbox and maybe different ways they would have thought of to bring solutions to our customers. So we're excited about that approach, and we'll continue to use this as well. So getting on to how do we discover and what are the challenges we have in trying to find flavor modifiers for reduced sodium products. So I want to talk a little bit about our science and technology group, how we're organized. And we basically are organized within how we do research in the stage gate process, where we have a discovery phase, which we call Explorer. We do an evaluation of the technology, and then we scale it up. Within Explorer, which is the group that I lead, the goal really is to go after disruption. We have great tools at Givaudan, and we're trying to find the next best solutions that are really differentiated and could bring something, stellar to our customers. As mentioned before, in addition to savory, which is primarily focused on, from the taste side, of course, sodium, but also umami. Sweet taste is a big one for us, but we have other categories that we work in, and they're listed here. In addition, also, we have what we call our digital technologies, which was the ATOM program that we use, but we have others as well that help us to make the flavors better. And we're working in the area of taste, but we also have expanded into, well-being, health, nutrition, that type of thing. But typically the solutions in Explorer and the stage we call Fine Technical Solution, we're really trying to develop the prototype or the new ingredient. This takes anywhere, the shortest it could take is somewhere around 6 months, but it could go beyond 2 years. So I'm really trying to give an indication of the time it takes. But once we have a solution, we'll make a prototype and we bring it to our apply group, which is made up of research flavorists, sensory scientists, and application scientists, and they'll apply this into different applications with flavors to basically highlight the potential of this ingredient and the solution to our internal customers, which in our 5 regions, which work with our customers, and they'll tell us what they think about that. And if they like it, then it'll then move on to development. And development is really, where do we come up with the cost-effective natural processes to make this ingredient, if it is indeed nature identical, and in a way that it can go into food products that consumers will love and buy. So we look at a lot of different processing technologies, but you can see the timelines around here from discovery and explore, where we have our natural product chemists, our analytical chemists, organic chemists, molecular biologists working for solutions. Can take up to 2 years or so. Apply could be about a year, and then the development could be long and even potentially costly. So it's no easy effort, especially in sodium reduction, to come up with solutions. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Just a second. Okay, so we have really 3 areas that we try to innovate in. The first one is what we call back to nature, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The second one is, of course, do we understand the mechanism of sodium chloride perception? And if we do, then we can exploit that to help discover new ingredients. And then finally, I'll go into the details of how we actually discover molecules, which have different functionality. And the goal really is to be able to come up with, with better products for our customers containing these ingredients. So from the back to nature side, we really look to see what people are doing around the world. How have they dealt with different products that have different levels of sodium chloride in them to make them palatable? You can think of course, different minerals that they've used, and we'll work with our procurement groups to see if we can source those to see how they impact sodium chloride taste. But there's also ways of looking at different botanicals and using these extracts in our solutions. So that's one area of focus. The next one that I mentioned is around trying to understand, how do humans perceive salt taste? So this is probably the least known of all the tastes from the mechanism. And so Givaudan is really trying to work in this space to figure out what's going on here, to be able to see indeed, how is this detected in the mouth? What are the receptors? What are the proteins involved? And there's a huge challenge here because you can imagine that all cells are impacted by sodium ions. And so there's probably ways of detecting the concentrations of sodium ions in all cells, but what makes taste cells particular? And so we are doing work with collaborators outside of Givaudan to try to understand this, and we're making some good progress. But as of now, we still don't fully understand the perception of sodium chloride detection. And of course, when we do, we would then try to bring that into a bioassay, which we've done with the other taste modalities, and we've had success in finding flavor modification for those. So we'll continue to work in this space, and it's really a great interest for us. But the third one is, and I'll talk a lot more about this, is our molecule discovery. And this is a primary objective of what my group does. And essentially, we're looking for molecules that exist in nature, that are found in foods that people eat, or plants, or different natural sources. And can we identify what they are, and then see how they impact sodium chloride perception. So there's ways that we go about doing that. One of the common ways that we've used is what's called taste-guided fractionation. And essentially what we can do here is we can start with a botanical or a food product, and we can make an extract of that. And then what we'll do is we'll taste that extract in different concentrations with a solution that contains sodium chloride at lower levels, and compare that to the full salt product. And what we're looking for is a lot of different things here. We're looking for, of course, overall salt perception enhancement, but there could be other things that are lacking when you reduce sodium chloride, such as some of the mouthfeel and body and other attributes there. And so once we've identified an interesting fraction, we'll go through the process of trying to basically take it apart and figure out what exactly are the key molecules in there that are driving this sensation. And so after extraction, we'll go through a type of chromatography, usually HPLC, and we'll chop it into different fractions. We'll dry those fractions down, and we'll concentrate them and then dissolve them into water, and we'll taste them individually with different concentrations of sodium chloride and compare them to the full strength, and then which fractions have activity. And from those, then we'll either further fractionate and repeat the process, or we'll then dry that down and try to figure out what exactly is the molecule structure of interest. And we'll use spectroscopy there. It could be NMR, it could be mass spec. Sometimes we even use IR. And then if we can, we'll try to either isolate a lot of that molecule pure, or we'll synthesize it using an organic group. And then we'll go through various levels of sensory validation at different concentrations to determine, this is indeed the structure of interest. And then this could be a target then for commercialization. And commercialization could be in a couple forms. One of them could be potentially around just trying to get that fraction scaled up, getting a lot of the source. But typically, we're finding molecules that are in low concentration, and so you can't really acquire enough material, especially now. Maybe in the past there were ways to do this because earlier discoveries, but what we're finding now are essentially trace compounds, and then we'll need other methods to try to make these. And the big hope for us is on fermentation. So we can use natural fermentation or a bioconversion to bring this through development. And so what's exciting for us is we then identified a natural structure. And for us, it's all about, that structure, that nature identical structure. And then what we're interested in is what other types of structures exist in nature that could have similar activity. In medicinal chemistry, typically in pharma, you could basically just synthesize different derivatives in an artificial way. But, Givaudan we're really trying to limit it to natural structures because that allows us to have natural flavor ingredients. So essentially the natural world is finite. And what we did is we developed a tool we call Natural Horizons, and that allows us to navigate through the known natural product space from a structure standpoint. And so in order to do this, to build this tool, we assembled a list of all known natural structures that have been published internally within Givaudan's proprietary, through all of our work, but also externally from natural product space. And it's somewhere around 500,000 compounds. But not all of these compounds are essentially suitable to be a flavor ingredient, right? They might have some toxicology, they won't have issues, they may have some different physical properties such as solubility or other complications that would make it not an ideal candidate for commercialization. So we put these 500,000 compounds through a filter, and we were able to come up with around 200,000 types of compounds. And how we decided to do this was essentially cluster the compounds by chemical structure. And what's neat here is you start to develop a map that almost looks like you have different continents of chemical classes, in which we can easily try to navigate through. And so if you look at the top upper left-hand corner, you can kind of see that each of these dots represents not usually one compound, but classes of chemical structures. And so you can imagine in the previous exercise where we identified a salt enhancer structure from a botanical, it might fall into one of these clusters. What we've seen is nature makes a lot of diverse structures, but the newer ones that we're finding aren't differing dramatically than currently existing. So most likely the things that we find today will be known to the past, but maybe they're just slightly different. And so we can then recall from these clusters all the different chemical structures that are found in nature. And then we can try to sort of navigate through each one of those to see, do they have different activity in terms of modifying, salt perception. Some interesting things to notice, what we've done is we've tied each of these individual compounds to their botanical species or their organism species, because there's also potentially mushrooms and other types of molecules in here. If you go to the upper right, you can see we've overlaid the Fema grass base in green, which is a small percentage of the overall compounds, right? The Fema grass compounds are in the order of thousands, where natural horizons is in the order of 200,000 different kind of compounds. The bottom left is just an example where we can say, where are all the compounds we found from the genus citrus? And citrus is super important for flavors. And so just to give you an example of where these compounds map throughout, and it's really interesting to see that. So there's a lot of potential to find new compounds here that could be flavor modifiers. And another technique we can do is if we have chemical leads, like the one we found earlier for a salt modifier, or even in general in savory taste, so we know compounds that have umami, and this could even be in the synthetic chemical space, we can compare similarities to known targets to those that are kind of mapping throughout the globe here with the different continents. And that's what you see down in the lower right hand, in which we can see areas of high probability to target to go after those compounds. We can synthesize them and say, well, maybe these are impacting savory taste from umami standpoint, or from what we know from sodium modification. So this, I guess in conclusion, this is a really terrific tool that we've developed and are able to use to help us go through. And from a personal standpoint, it's very satisfying to see that the natural world is essentially finite, and given enough resources, we'll be able to exhaustively go through and determine the flavor potential of all natural compounds. Just to give you an idea, on the right-hand side is just the order of magnitude, right? If you get into the synthetic space, it's tremendously much larger in orders and orders of magnitude. But we're really kind of focused more on the natural side because that's what our customers want. Although it'll be interesting to see where the future holds. Okay, so that's natural horizons, and I do want to share, an example, a specific example of a compound we found, and hopefully I can, go to the next slide here. Okay, so here's a novel salt enhancer we found over the last few years. We have since filed for a patent on this. We use that similar fractionation technique I mentioned earlier, in which we were looking at an African cuisine. And the nice thing is Givaudan has research groups in multiple places. One of them, we have a big site in Amsterdam, and you can get all sorts of different cuisines from great restaurants there. And so we had done some studies that there's some potential cuisines from Africa that could be impacting the taste of salt. We found some products, we did extracts, we tasted, we did fractionation, we identified a novel molecule that is impacting the taste of sodium chloride. And what we can see here is we purify that compound, and then we can put it into a base that's closer to a broth, and we can see that we can push the sodium perception by around 30% with this one molecule, which is really quite exciting. And so now we have a molecule that's moved into development, and we're trying to scale it up through a bioprocess, and this is going to take some time. But what we're hoping is that we can also combine this with our other tools in our toolbox. We're targeting some of the applications. The big ones, of course, are snacks, but there's other things in the culinary range and what we call plant attitude, which essentially are the plant-based proteins that are used in alternative meats. Sodium is a huge part of that, and if we can help make those products taste better, but also have less sodium, that's really terrific. So we're still in development, and we're still, kind of far from commercialization. It's going to take some time. And that's one thing I wanted to bring to the attention, is also just from a regulatory standpoint, it's getting, more challenging to bring things through regulation. So FEMA is the body that basically decides which molecules can go on the FEMA GRAS list, which make up the list of ingredients that can be used to make flavors in the US. And essentially the time frame there is close to between half a year to a year and a half. And the big time consuming step is, do you need to do tox studies here for this? The big issue with that is, if the structure that you discover does not exist or is far from known in the current FEMA GRAS structure space, then usually you do a taste study there. And remember, the molecules we're finding are usually in foods that people have been eating for years, years. So, but we want to make sure, what these compounds can do. And so here's the process we see through FEMA. We may have some customers online or some who are considered, with global products, and you then may be aware of the timelines that are in Europe, and these are even longer. And some legislation's gone through that, to get on the EU list, it could now take up to 3 to 5 years, depending. So I just want to inform some of the challenges to some of people potentially making decisions and the impacts there. That yes, even when we find solutions, it can be very challenging to bring these through commercialization. But then there's also concerns around the regulatory environment to bring these all the way through to get them on the list. So just to summarize, we have a very in-depth scientific team, multidisciplinary, going after some of the challenges to address sodium reduction, especially in the space of flavor modification. We do this internally at Givaudan, but also work with partners to help us, and especially where in the areas of across all areas, really. That's the nice thing about working with Givaudan is we really can work with the best. And then the goal is to have proprietary technology that our flavors can use in their toolbox, that when they're working with their customers to make those reduced sodium products taste great. And what we're really going after here is it's all about, for us, is enabling low sodium products to have the same food experience that consumers love as the full strength products. And so it was really a pleasure to present to you, and I look forward to questions later on in the session.
Wonderful, and thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate you taking us through this discovery phase of identifying new compounds, mechanisms of taste, and really the complexity of building this toolbox that we need to recreate the flavor portion of the sodium reduction in food products. I think your presentation gave a really good insight on the complexity, time it takes to really address the flavor portion. And I appreciate your efforts and your work at Givaudan in trying to solve this challenge. But as we know, the challenge of reducing sodium really goes beyond flavor, as many sodium-containing ingredients have very specific functional roles in shaping the design of a food product. Think about other sensory attributes such as texture or structure of foods, the microbiology, be it food safety or from a fermentation perspective, etc. Our next speaker, John Yagi, will address the technical challenge of sodium reduction from more of a structured texture area in the natural cheese, from a natural cheese perspective, as well as discovery of inherent elements or compounds within milk or cheeses to provide salty taste at a lower sodium content. John is a third-generation Wisconsin licensed cheesemaker who began his career about 45 years ago with the family cheese business in Greene County, Wisconsin. He started at the Center of Dairy Research over 30 years ago as the Center Research Cheesemaker. Today, John coordinates the cheese industry and applications group in addition to coordinating the Wisconsin Master Cheesemaker program. He is actively involved with all aspects of the cheese industry, including product development, troubleshooting, research activities, short course training, and cheese judging. He has experience in all types of cheeses, including the natural cheeses, processed cheeses, cheese creams, and cold packed cheese. John is also active as a member of various dairy and trade organizations. With that, I'll turn it over to you, John, to share your research with us.
That sounds good. Thank you, Janice, and thank you everyone for joining me today. So we're going to talk about cheese. So what I want to do is kind of start and look a little bit at the actual use of salt and sodium chloride in cheese, kind of going through the process, kind of get the industry perspective on all of this, look at low sodium cheeses, just a brief recap of R&D work that has went on here at the Center for Dairy Research and across our industry. And then to finish up, we'll look at dairy ingredients, particularly permeate, and some of the work that we had done a few years ago looking at sodium replacement in cheese. So let's talk about introduction to cheese salting. And I don't know how many of you out there are familiar with the cheese manufacturing process or how salt is applied, but there's different methods in cheese to apply salt. So probably one of the most common methods to apply salt is direct addition to the curd. Now, one of the things that we hear a lot or that people will ask, well, why are there variations in salt content in cheese? And there's a number of reasons for that. And amongst that, cheese is a continual process. It's very difficult to get exact weights because cheese has living bacteria in it. So there's rates of syneresis depending on starter culture activity. So weights of cheese can vary from vat to vat. You have seasonality impacts from milk and protein levels that will vary seasonally. And with that, that can cause slight variations in yield. Now, larger manufacturers that have abilities to standardize casein and fat ratios, they can have a little better handle on their yield, vat to vat, where a smaller manufacturer might see a little more variation. So therefore, you can get some variations in sodium level in cheese. But direct addition, as you see here in the picture, is one method. Another one that's maybe a little less common is the surface rubs, rubbing salt on the surface of the cheese. Cheese curds that might go through a conveyor system where the salt is blown directly on. But you can see even by that picture, you can get variations in the amount of salt per pound of cheese. And then finally, you have the brining systems. And from my experience, the brining systems are probably the most difficult to control of all the different cheese salt application methods. And brining can be difficult both from the volume of cheese, the temperature of the brines, the condition of the cheese, the amount of moisture. So there's a lot of variations that go in that can cause some variability when brining cheese. So these are some of the more common methods of getting salt into natural cheeses. So why does a cheesemaker add salt? Well, there's many reasons. One of them is to promote moisture loss during cheese making. If you think about cheese making, it's really not different than a chef. You have a recipe that you follow, and in the case of cheese, we have different pH critical control points that we follow. But everything we do, we try to develop certain textures and flavors. And one of the things along the line is controlling moisture loss in cheese making. And salt is very critical to controlling that. It controls the growth of starter culture bacteria and non-starter lactic acid bacteria. So we add cultures that ferment lactose into lactic acid to give our cheeses different flavors. And we have environmental bacteria that are also involved in this process. So salt helps control that. So it is important in the process. It controls body and texture of the cheese, which is important. Both our cheese converters, the people that cut the cheese into slices, cubes, sticks, shreds that you see in the retail market, they have expectations. The consumers have expectations of what certain cheeses should have as far as texture and mouthfeel. So salt helps control those expectations of all those different end users. Also, it enhances flavor and controls cheese aging. This is critical, and we see that a lot in our involvement. We conduct a lot of sensory panels, do a lot of product development and research, judge and cheese contests. So we see this a lot, and we can emphatically tell you reduction in salt has a big impact on the aging of cheese, and that's due to water activity. Because the less salt that's added, the water activity goes up, the more the bacteria become more active, and it's much tougher to control that process. So it becomes very difficult. And it's a hurdle step for food safety. Now, you heard Dr. Kathy Glass yesterday talk about food safety, and I'm not going to get into that in this presentation. And she also talked about processed cheese in great deal. So again, this is going to focus specifically on natural cheeses. So when we talk about salt impact on cheese body and texture, one of the things that impact it, like I said, is the moisture, particularly in Parmesan. Now, in the Parmesan market, this is growing in the United States by leaps and bounds. And Parmesan is made traditionally, which is brined, but non-traditionally, a large percentage of our Parmesan industry manufactures it using the direct salting method like the picture you saw. So Parmesan, according to the Code of Federal Regulation, moisture standards has to be 32% moisture or less. So one of the ways to meet the CFR standards using a direct salted manufacturing process is to control it as salt. Is one of the primary reasons, and you will notice on sodium levels, Parmesan tends to run a little on the higher side. Well, this is one of the reasonings is to control moisture content. Lack of salt, particularly in cheddars, 640-pound blocks of cheese that's used in conversion, Monterey Jack, Colby's, other cheeses, a lack of salt can result in a soft, pasty body, which will be very difficult to slice and shred on the high-speed slice lines and shred lines. So it becomes difficult with salt level becomes too low. In general, higher salt means a firmer body. Salt enhances cheese flavor, as we all know. Salt is a flavor intensifier. A lot of times when we look at cheese and it lacks salt, and we hear it from consumer panelists, they consider it flat, lacks taste, lacks flavor. Low salt, like I had mentioned earlier, means less microbiological control of my starter cultures or non-starter bacteria that are environmental in nature. That can cause wild off flavors. For example, fruity fermented, bitterness, excessive acidity. And a lot of times when we look at sodium levels, when sodium levels go down, bitterness and acidity can go up. So it helps control that, not only through microcontrol, but it also helps with control of the acidity and excessive development of lactic acid. Salt also helps with the aroma compounds in ripened cheeses, particularly some of the surface ripened cheeses, mold ripened cheeses, and even the vacuum packaged cheeses. When you open those packages, it really helps with the ammonia or with the aromatic compounds. So let's look a little bit at low sodium cheeses in general from a couple perspectives. First of all, you saw this list, and that's the whole reason that we have this webinar series, is the FDA is doing the voluntary sodium reduction in selected cheeses using the 2010 baseline, and they're now looking at different levels of sodium going forward. Now, the one thing I want to point out, I just threw some cheeses here that are probably some of the largest consumed cheeses in the United States. So I put them here. The FDA has a list much more robust than this as it involves cheese. But one of the things that I want to point out, when you talk to cheesemakers on salt level, a lot of the cheesemakers do not talk sodium levels, they talk chloride levels. So when I analyze, for example, cheddar cheese, and you can see here the baseline for 2010 was 659 milligrams per 100 grams of serving. But what a cheesemaker would look at that, and where my mind goes based on experience, I would say, okay, that cheddar would have probably a 1.6 to 1.8% salt on a chloride analyzer. So if any of you talk to cheesemakers, they may get a little glassy-eyed when you talk milligrams per serve, milligrams of sodium per serving, but then immediately, we'll talk, okay, we're talking this percent on a chloride analyzer, and then it's like, oh, okay. So that kind of gives you a perspective. Parmesan, you see here, 1579, one of the higher ones, that along with feta, milligrams per serving. Parmesan runs about 2.5 to 3% salt on a chloride analyzer, just to give you some perspective when we talk about this. So from a manufacturing perspective with this, what do they think of all the sodium reduction? First of all, some of them frankly ignore it because this has gone on for 25 years where we bring it up. They say this is voluntary. And the big thing, they don't necessarily ignore it, but nobody's asking for it. We kind of look at it as a carrot and stick. It's a lot better when you have people asking for it and demanding it, and the manufacturers will comply. But right now, there's just not a lot of people asking for sodium reduction. So a lot of the manufacturers really aren't looking at that. But those that do have markets looking at sodium reduction, the overwhelming majority that I'm aware of just simply cut back on the amount of salt that they apply either directly, cut back on brining times, or make recipe adjustments to offset the impacts with sodium reduction. You heard earlier, salt enhancers, sodium replacers, that work has went on for many, many years, looking at masking agents, bringing out different flavors. So some manufacturers may use some of those options as well. But at CDR, we tell people, think outside the box a little bit. So as an industry, should we be targeting like cheddars, mozzarellas, parmesans, or should we think outside the box and go another route? Should we develop cheeses? And we've worked with people, develop cheeses with lower sodium contents that meet the dietary needs or that people may ask for. We've looked at spices. Are there different spices that augment that salt perception or that bring it out? We tend to find peppers, for example, heat tends to minimize the amount of salt needed. Yogurt cheese, for example, or other cheese varieties where maybe the milligrams per serving could be weighed down, but yet the consumers will connect to that as instead of looking possibly down the road of going to great reductions in other cheese varieties. So what do the consumers want out of sodium reduction when we talk? Well, obviously, they're not buying a lot of it right now because if they were, the manufacturers would be happy to fill those needs. So a lot of that right now isn't being asked for because the flavor, in best cases, it's flat. In worst cases, it's an off-flavored product. And textures tend to not represent what the normal cheese is that the consumer expects out of a cheddar cheese, out of a Parmesan, out of a Colby or Monterey Jack or a Munster, for example. Consumers currently do have options on cheeses that taste very good, that are very popular, that would be considered low sodium. Fresh mozzarella, Swiss cheese, ricotta, mascarpone are just some examples of cheeses already that would fit under low sodium options that consumers could go to right today, and nobody, when evaluating, would say these cheeses lack salt perception. So I think consumers would buy low sodium cheese, absolutely, but the key is the cheese has to taste good and the price has to be reasonable when they go to buy it. Those are some of the keys that we see in working with consumers and retail companies, quick serve restaurant chains throughout the vertical chain. Those are some of the comments we see. So talking about low sodium cheese R&D, and we kind of laugh about it. Oh, everyone's done research in R&D. What more can we learn? But there's always something to learn. So there's things that go on that are proprietary. There's things that go on that are public information. One of the things that we've worked with over the years, yeast extracts are something that are added to try to bring out different flavor profiles to try to either augment the sodium perception or to maybe try to bring other flavors into the matrix. But sometimes with using some of these ingredients, you just have to be a little careful that you don't take a product that a consumer is used to tasting and turn it into something else. For example, cheddar cheese. If I'm using different ingredients, I don't want a cheese that doesn't represent cheddar anymore. It represents something else, because is that really cheddar? So from a consumer standpoint, marketing standpoint, manufacturing standpoint, something that we're just concerned with. Soy sauce, and it gets back to what you heard earlier. And the reason soy sauce, which yes, soy sauce has sodium, but then you replace the application of salt, you cut that back and replace it with this because of the umami. And you heard that in the last presentation about the umami flavors bring out that flavor perception and minimizes the need for salt. Propionic acid, isovaleric flavors are another one. Why doesn't Swiss cheese taste like it lacks salt? What is Swiss? So our head goes around, okay, what is it about Swiss cheese that's so much different than cheddar and others that I don't notice Swiss cheese is low in salt? From a chloride analyzer, it's 0.3% to 0.5%. It's very low. It can be considered low sodium if it's manufactured correctly. So propionic acid, isovaleric flavors, is there something there that could be done? And we've looked at that historically here. This is a big one, and I think there's actually a little bit of an undercounting of research that's done under the guise of sodium reduction as opposed to maybe other applications, as I'll get into here in a little bit. But basically with looking at make recipes, we can do different adjustments, everything from milk standardization, looking at that, adjusting pH target points, adjusting cultures and adjuncts, coagulant types, proteolytic activity, uses of spices, and developing new cheese varieties, like I said. Now, with going through these make recipe adjustments, there's a couple things at play here. One of the things we're looking at doing, you heard me earlier say if I reduce salt, I can end up with excessive moisture. I can end up with body and textural issues. So by manipulating some of these make processes and make recipes in these different cheeses, we can maybe offset some reduction in sodium. Some. When you go to drastic or salt-free or no addition of salt whatsoever, those might take more drastic changes and manipulation of your make recipes to get those to work. Sodium replacers, obviously we've heard about that. They're on the market. There's a lot of R&D going on at big companies looking at sodium replacers, whether it's potassium or whether it's calcium. The other technology that we had worked with a number of years ago had come into being from France, the use of high pressure processing. This technology came in the early 2000s, and we have done extensive work here at the CDR, and the industry is starting to utilize this for a number of different areas. And what high pressure processing simply is putting cheese into a vessel of water. It's closed, water is pumped into pressures upwards of 87,000 PSI. And what that does is lyse cells to give you more flavor, because the cells lyse, spill their enzymes, you get more flavor. And it also log cycle reduction, any potential contaminants that could be in the cheese. And we found it to be quite effective in cases of lower and reduced sodium cheese manufacturers, you can see here by the picture. This is one area, export opportunities, that our industry that we're working very closely, and we have a lot of research projects currently ongoing under looking at shelf life extensions and storage temperatures and times, because if you look at the export market, and the Center for Dairy Research is actively involved with the Department of Ag here in Wisconsin, as well as the U.S. Dairy Export Council. These pictures here were from China. We actually have a member going to the Asian Pacific Rim next week. And if you look at the export market, a lot of these cheeses are lower in salt and sodium, sometimes upwards of 30, 40% less, because that's the expectation with mozzarella, with Goudas, and other cheese varieties. So even if the consumers domestically aren't looking for it, if we want to play in the export market, we do have to be aware and know how to handle that and meet those needs. So let's take a look at dairy ingredients and reduction in sodium in cheese. The picture to my left is a co-worker of mine here at the Center for Dairy Research, Dr. Susan Larson, who has been instrumental in the use of dairy ingredients to replace sodium, doing a lot of recipe development. The pizza you see on the right was actually something that we had developed and showcased at a cheese forum looking at sodium reduction. And you heard at the very beginning talking about pizza and the issues with pizza being high in sodium. But in our case, we looked at sodium reduction in crust, in cheese to be able to meet the low sodium requirements. So if we talk about permeate, what are we talking about? If you look on a package, it's known as permeate, whey permeate, milk permeate, dairy product solids, modified whey, or deproteinized whey. It's on the market today in various foods. You can see how it's made. It's basically just a byproduct of ultrafiltration, microfiltration, and reverse osmosis. But depending on the type of filtration you use, the constituents of the permeate are going to be a little bit different. And when we talk about permeate, the retentate is utilized either to make powders, milk protein isolates, or whey protein isolates or concentrates, or in the case of if it's milk, it's used in cheese making. Permeate is what we're going to talk about. So what is permeate? Greatly simplified. The truck backs up into a silo where you have whey coming from your processing lines. The whey is separated. The whey is pasteurized, and then it's run through a membrane, concentrated. So it goes off, and you can use it for different whey protein isolates, or it goes into permeate. As you can see, that's what permeate looks like. That comes off. The permeate then goes through a series of concentration steps. And remember, this is a very simplified process. So the permeate is concentrated. We remove water, we remove lactose, we spray dry it, and you end up with your final deproteinized whey product. So with that, if we look at deproteinized whey and delactosed whey, you can see here the percentage makeup of the different ingredients. A couple things I want to point out. Calcium and potassium have both been targeted and talked about as potential sodium replacers. You can see here in the permeate what the level of that is, and you can see here after removing lactose that the level goes up, and there is work to be done in this area. As we remove more and more carbohydrates or lactose, as that's removed, the amount and percentage of calcium and potassium do increase. So permeate also has non-protein nitrogen compounds, urea, creatine, creatinine, uric acid, orotic acid, and ammonia. And ammonia also gives cheese different flavor profiles, and they're flavor potentiators. Then we have our mineral salts, calcium phosphate, magnesium, sodium, potassium, and there's been a little bit of work in this area, and Dr. Frankowski and Dr. Marianne Drake at North Carolina State have done work on this, and permeate shows a lot of potential as a sodium replacer in cheese and in other food ingredients. Wrapping up, you can see here using the different dairy ingredients, we've done a lot of work, not just in cheese, but in various ingredients where our applications group have looked at it in different snacks, and we've actually featured these products at IDF and different forums where we've shown these, and it met with great success. As you can see here, looking at all the different products that we looked at sodium replacers, and by using permeate, we found that 10 to 11 grams of permeate will replace 1 gram of sodium. But if we reduce and do further reduction in lactose in that permeate, we could even drop that number, that it'll take less permeate to replace more sodium. So this technology actually has a lot of potential going forward. So very exciting. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'll turn it back over to Janice and Trish and the speakers and be happy to answer any questions you may have. And thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, John. And, there's no doubt consumers certainly enjoy the taste of cheese, but really underestimate the complexity of this living organism. So I appreciate your work and the work that CD or Center for Dairy Research for trying to improve cheese production and address key issues like sodium reduction. So it's interesting how you dissect the components within the milk and cheese that can really lead to new discoveries for compounds and minerals in the various streams for cheese production that, like whey, that can help address that sodium issue. I feel that having a sodium reduction, a solution like this that comes from milk, can sometimes make it easier for product developers, cheese manufacturers, and possibly consumers to accept. As I said, the average consumer really has little insights on the complexity of food manufacturing. As we just learned, cheese production is complex, just as like we saw and learned from Andrew's flavor research and what we learned from Sue's literature and survey research. With that, as I would like everyone, the speakers, to turn on their cameras, and Trish, you can help us field through some of the questions that have come from our audience members.
Absolutely. We have a very engaged audience today. So since we just finished with John and you were just talking about permeates, we have a couple questions about that. So the first is, if permeates are already used in food today, that means that they're available to be used in food and wouldn't have to go through that long approval process and development stage that Andrew was talking about. Is that true?
Absolutely correct. Yes.
Okay. And then if that's the case, how could permeates be used in mozzarella cheese?
So permeates in mozzarella cheese. Now there's different ways to manufacture mozzarella cheese. You can manufacture it with the brining and that way, but you can also make it by a stir-curd, direct salt, pressed black mozzarella, in which case in those options you could utilize that. There's also new technology to extrude mozzarella and making a pasta filata mozzarella using a waterless cooker. So there are ways to get it incorporated into the cheese, either through the waterless or through using the direct salt method, where you just mix in the permeate where you saw the picture with the sodium and just topically apply it on top. So Trish, there are ways to do that. Absolutely, yes.
And then based on the FDA guidance on use of in the standard identity of cheese, does that mean that the cheese could still just be labeled mozzarella cheese?
Correct, yes, because it's all standard of identity product. You're using dairy products. You're not using any chemicals, anything that's not natural in there. Yes, it would all fit. Because if you look at the CFR standards, there are no sodium levels in the CFR standards. I mean, it's basically moisture, some manufacturing guidelines, and fat and dry matter are kind of the guide rails. So yes, it could be used in a standard of identity manufacture of cheese varieties, sure.
And then the last question in this same area, what are your opinions of other opportunities that the FDA changing the standard of identity of cheese to allow for the use of KCl or other ingredients like permeates, within the standard? What other opportunities do you think that regulation provides to cheesemakers?
Well, that's a tough one to wrap my head around. It provides a lot of opportunity, but I think the big thing is with any of these, we have to find consumer acceptability. That's the biggest hurdle that I see right now. The industry is willing to utilize anything in the holster as long as the consumers want it. If the consumers don't ask for it, if they don't want it, that's what becomes difficult. So when you talk about potassium and sodium replacers, the biggest issue that I hear is the cheese tends to have off flavors, and Janice had mentioned it, either bitterness, chemical off flavor notes. For example, Dr. Mark Johnson and myself here at CDR, we're very sensitive to potassium chloride to the point we get a chemical note even low levels at even 10% to 15% replacement of sodium with potassium. So we get sensitive as other consumers will too. So I think there's potential there, but work in masking agents or developing umami or other flavors, kind of like Andrew talked about at Givaudan, companies such as his and others looking at that, ways to help, I think Trish would help.
Okay, great. And sticking to that, because we did have a couple of questions about potassium chloride and its metallic taste. So one submission said often clients complain that potassium chloride is very metallic tasting and unpalatable, but based on the information that Sue Lee and Andrew showed, it's one of the most used ingredients in salt reduction. So what are some other acceptable alternatives to potassium chloride, not specifically in cheese? And if there's not really good replacements for potassium chloride, what are the ingredients that help mitigate those metallic aftertastes? That was a lot of question in there.
Yeah, I can start out and then let Lee and Andrew kind of jump in. But from my perspective, like I said, with the permeate, we didn't notice the metallic off flavors quite as much as we did when actually using sodium replacers. Now, is that because of the other non-protein nitrogen components that were in there? Was it because of some of the carbohydrates that were there that masked that? I don't know. If we were to go and remove more lactose from that permeate and thereby raise our minerals, our potassium and other trace minerals, could that result in that off flavor? I don't know. That's an area that would have to be worked on. I had mentioned propionic acid, in Swiss cheese. Why does that not taste like it's low in salt, developing of isovaleric flavors? Is there anything there? I don't know. And I'll kind of turn it over to Sue Lee and I'll turn it over to Andrew. Maybe they have a different perspective or additional comments as well.
Yeah, in fact, potassium chloride is the most widely used according to our study, and it's most widely published. I think there's reasons behind it. It's easy to implement, as well as there's a need for more consumption of potassium in contrast to less consumption of sodium. So it's a good health alternative too, although there's subpopulation that do not benefit from more potassium too. So that's something to think about, like people with kidney diseases. Using blends of chloride variety salts, like magnesium was mentioned, calcium chloride was mentioned. Lithium chloride is really close to sodium chloride, but it's a poison, so you can't use it. It's one of the, I heard it's one of the closest tastes to sodium chloride. And then so the newer ones that we find in academic publication is to use a blend of salt replacers and flavor enhancers, or herbs and spices. So you're using synergistic effect of sensory aspect. So not just the taste modifiers, but the aroma modifiers and also textural modifiers. So for example, like umami and kokumi. Kokumi is more like a mouthfeel enhancement that could be brought up. And then using very small amount of potassium chloride so that the metallic and bitter taste doesn't come through as much, but then add a small amount of MSG that enhances the savoriness, which is quite different from just pure saltiness, and it has a temporal profile to it. But it seems like there's more publication in that area. And then I was very fascinated with Andrew's research, and they're proprietary yet not so very much proprietary, since he can share it with us of the findings from Givaudan. So Givaudan and flavor houses would be the main leading companies that would be.
Yeah. Yes, too. I showed the toolbox approach. So, the different tools in the toolbox do different things that the flavors use. And we do have we do have maskers for potassium chloride. We also do use different, you mentioned different combinations of cations and whatnot. So it really depends upon what the customer wants. That will, we can do it, of course, without using any potassium chloride as well. So.
Yeah, and I'll just put one add-on about potassium chloride. In replacement for salt, salt does a lot of things in food products. So it's more than just flavor. It's about altering the texture, changing protein modification. Think about it does fermentation, which is really important, especially like cheese production, where you're going after certain flavors that come up with it. Obviously, there's a food safety component as well. So when you look at potassium chloride, there's really no other ingredient that can do all the other things that salt does aside from the flavors. And that's why it's really a nice tool, because you can get that protein extraction you need. Go play on the texture. You look at the water activity, getting that in check. But its biggest hurdle is the flavor, which is so important for those flavor houses to really kind of help us. How do we overcome that flavor?
I think we have time for one more question, and this is a biggie. So a couple of you had shared information that consumers aren't really asking for it, or customers aren't asking for it. So, and I know that's two different things. So customers aren't asking the flavor houses maybe, or the cheese makers for low sodium cheeses. But if the consumers really want it, who do they ask? They're saying, like, who do we ask for products with less sodium? And how do we get stores to carry them?
Well, we're definitely having customers ask us to help them. There's no doubt. So they must be listening to consumers as well. I'm not sure it's at the level that's being recommended, maybe, but we're definitely we have briefs in those spaces. So it's a big part of what we do.
I mean, from my perspective, working in the food industry, I think that consumers need to, contact their retailers first. Where do you shop? Does your store carry low sodium cheeses or low sodium products in general? And, contact your retailers and ask for those products, because in my experience, if the retailers want them because consumers are asking, then the manufacturers will make them. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. And I mean, there's different avenues a person can look to see what consumption of low sodium products are Mintel, and there's other ways you can go and kind of check to see what sales are in different avenues. But working with all the large chains and all the large converters that you see in the retail segments, and we communicate with them all the time. And this was a question we've asked them. And after I was asked to present, I reached out to a number of them, and they said no, they just are not getting a lot of overwhelming response. Probably the biggest driver the last few years has been the school lunch program. And we've worked a lot with the school lunch program and USDA and some of their office looking to source low sodium. And one of the things that the school lunch program has looked at is looking at Swiss cheese. And we actually got a research project that will be starting looking at Swiss cheese, because that is low in sodium, and the school lunch program is driving that. So I think through education forums such as this and the speakers, and continuing to work on it, I think consumers will get up to snuff with that. But again, as of today, right now, from our end, we're not seeing a lot of requests other than school lunch program.
So if I may add, consumer versus customer is different. So customer, especially in the house of Givaudan and flavor houses, are manufacturers that create consumer products. Consumers, like individual consumers, they actually may not be aware how much sodium they consume. That is quite detrimental. That's the consumer education part that is needed. A lot of consumers are aware of sugar and the need of sugar reduction and need of fat reduction, but not much as sodium reduction. But the reports have it that up to 10% of death in the United States can be attributed to overconsumption of salt. That's a lot. So with that, the education of, you actually need to reduce salt in your food. And that's really more difficult. And another reason consumers don't ask for it, low sodium products have been not as successful as other reduced fat or sugar products. So people seeing low sodium or reduced sodium, they like go, okay, I'm not going to buy that, but that was not palatable. So it is also.
And we will talk about that more. We are out of time, and I really appreciate. We had a very engaged audience, and I really appreciate all your wonderful presentations. We will be discussing more about the consumer, sensory, and other insights in our remaining webinar. So I hope you will join us in those webinars. If you have any additional questions, you can reach out to me directly at trishbecca@ifins.org, or you can engage with iFins on our website or on our LinkedIn channel. So thank you very much for today, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Have a great day.